Welcome back to Talk Tickers, everybody. I know you're all used to us, diving deep into those earnings calls, but today, whoa, major change of plans. We've got this massive breaking news dropping out of Syria.
You're not kidding. We're talking shockwaves across the globe level stuff here.
Yeah.
The Syrian Arab Army in Damascus has officially surrendered.
Yeah, officially surrendered. This is huge EE, right? This is one of those events that's gonna, have ripple effects for, not just the Middle East, but probably everywhere.
Oh, yeah, this is going to be felt everywhere. And for any of our listeners out there who might be thinking, Syria, what's that got to do with me? What's that got to do with my portfolio? Well, buckle up, folks. The truth is, this event is going to have ripple effects. We're talking geopolitics, energy markets, refugee flows, and even some potential investment opportunities. We'll get to those later, though.
Right. Gotta love a good crisis for a little market shakeup. Am I right? Kidding. But okay, let's break this down. What actually happened? How did we get here? Our sources, they paint a pretty wild picture. So rewind to November 27th, 2024. That's when the opposition group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, they launched this mega offensive. They called it deterrence of aggression.
HTS, they've been a major player in this whole Syrian civil war thing, controlling the Idlib governorate. Basically, they just went all in, threw everything they had at the government forces in Aleppo.
And they weren't messing around, right? They teamed up, coordinated with the Syrian National Army, the SNA. They had their own offensive going on at the same time, called it, Dawn of Freedom?
Dawn of Freedom, yeah. It was pretty effective, honestly. Between the two of them, they managed to capture something like 237 cities, towns, villages, military bases, and get this, all within 6 days. Just 6 days.
6 days? That's insane. Talk about a blitzkrieg. But, obviously, this kind of military action, there's a human cost, a big one. It's rough. This offensive displaced, estimated 178,000 people.
Yep.
And that's on top of the millions who've already been displaced thanks to this whole horrible conflict.
Yeah, it's a humanitarian catastrophe for sure. And this latest displacement just adds to the, the years of suffering that folks have been enduring. Our briefing note, it's pretty grim, talks about a complete breakdown of services, shelter, food, healthcare, education. It's a mess.
A total mess. And I think, to really get a grasp on just how big this surrender is, we need to rewind a bit, right? Look at the bigger picture. The Syrian civil war, this isn't some recent thing. This has been raging for over a decade. It's messy, multi-sided, tons of different factions.
Right. It's been a long and bloody conflict. You can't just, parachute into this moment without understanding the historical context. It started back in 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings. People were fed up with Assad, with his whole regime, and they wanted change. Yeah,
demanding reforms, more freedoms. It all started pretty peacefully, too, right? Protests, demonstrations. But then things escalated.
Yeah, pretty quickly, actually. Assad's regime, they didn't exactly handle the protests with, kid gloves. They cracked down hard, and it just spiraled from there. Armed conflict, different rebel groups popping up all over the place. It turned into a full-blown civil war.
And not just any civil war, right? This one attracted all sorts of, outside players. Russia backing Assad, the U.S. supporting certain rebel groups.
Right. It became a proxy war. Regional and global powers all meddling, pursuing their own agendas, and, making the whole thing that much more complicated and brutal.
It's a total mess. And now, with this surrender, we're entering, uncharted territory. No one really knows what's going to happen next.
It's a critical juncture, that's for sure. There are a lot of unknowns, but there's one thing that's certain. The Syrian people, they've been through hell. And, the international community, we've got a responsibility to help them. We'll get into that a bit later, too.
Absolutely. But for now, Talk Tickers listeners, we love to get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
So let's dig deeper. Let's unpack this whole Syrian civil war, figure out how it led to this point.
Let's do it. We've got a lot to cover. Let's go back to the beginning, trace the whole trajectory of this war, see if we can identify the turning points, the factions, all that.
Yeah, good idea. So our Wikipedia source, it's got a pretty decent timeline of the conflict. It highlights some of the big moments, the things that really shaped the course of the war.
It's a good starting point. So let's rewind back to those early days of the uprising, see how the government's response, basically how they fueled this whole rebellion.
Yeah. So our source It mentions that in the early days, Assad's regime, they tried to paint the protesters as like foreign-backed terrorists.
Yeah.
Trying to discredit them, justify their crackdown. Propaganda 101.
Classic move, right. Control the narrative. They used the state media to push this idea that, the country was under attack from outside forces. Problem was, most Syrians, they weren't buying it.
Nope. They were seeing the brutality firsthand. And our Wikipedia article, it points out that this whole heavy-handed approach, using excessive force against peaceful protesters, well, it backfired big time. It just made things worse, pushed more people toward the opposition.
Exactly. I mean, you start shooting at unarmed civilians, people are going to get radicalized, their resolve is just going to harden. A lot of Syrians, they might have been hesitant to fight at first, but after seeing that kind of violence, they were convinced that peaceful protest wasn't going to cut it.
Yeah, and talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The government's attempts to suppress dissent, it just blew up in their faces. It led to a much wider and more violent conflict.
Totally. It's a classic case of how a regime trying to silence its people just ends up making things way worse. And that's exactly what happened in Syria. It went from peaceful protests to a full-blown civil war, years of bloodshed, and, well, here we are.
So as things escalated, different rebel groups started popping up, each with their own, ideologies, goals, strategies.
Right. It wasn't just one unified opposition. And if you really want to understand the Syrian civil war, you got to understand these different factions, their motivations, who they're aligned with, all of it.
Because, let's be honest, it looks like a total tangled web from the outside.
Oh, it is. Alliances shifting, rivalries, it's a mess. But let's try to untangle it a bit. Let's focus on some of the major players, the ones who really shaped the course of this whole conflict.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's start with the Free Syrian Army, the FSA. They were one of the main opposition groups early on, right?
Yep, the FSA. Initially, they were mostly defectors from the Syrian Arab Army, soldiers who were like, okay, I'm done with this regime, and decided to join the rebellion.
So they were fighting against their former buddies. That's got to be weird.
Yeah, a bit awkward, for sure. But they were pretty effective early on, actually. The FSA gained a lot of ground, captured territory in different parts of the country.
But they weren't exactly like a cohesive unit. There were divisions within the FSA, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The FSA, it was never this perfectly unified force. It was more like an umbrella organization, with all these different local militias under it, each one with their own leaders, their own goals, their own loyalties.
And that lack of unity, I'm guessing that hurt them in the long run.
It definitely didn't help. Made it tough for them to coordinate their attacks, present a united front against the government. Plus, it made them more vulnerable, Easy to infiltrate, manipulate. External actors could play them against each other.
Yeah, classic divide and conquer tactics. Happens all the time in these kinds of conflicts. Hard to maintain unity when everyone's got their own agenda.
Exactly. And that's a big part of the reason why Assad was able to hold on for so long. The opposition was just too fragmented, too busy fighting amongst themselves to really challenge him effectively.
Okay, so we've got this fractured opposition. And then as the war dragged on, things got even messier, right? More extreme groups started to emerge, taking advantage of the chaos.
Right. And that's where you get groups like Jabhat al-Nusra linked to al-Qaeda, and then, of course, the infamous ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They really upped the ante on the brutality front.
Oh, yeah, ISIS. Talk about a game changer. They were brutal, they were terrifying, and they had these, grand ambitions, a whole caliphate across the entire region.
Exactly. And ISIS wasn't just fighting Assad. They were also clashing with other rebel groups. So now you've got this multi-sided war within a war, and that just added to the complexity and the horror of the whole thing.
So much for a united front.
Right. Yeah.
The groups that were supposed to be fighting for a better future for Syria, they ended up turning on each other.
Yeah.
It's just tragic. Prolong the suffering, undermine their own cause.
Totally. And that fragmentation, it played right into Assad's hands, gave him the breathing room to consolidate his power, focus on key areas. While the rebels were busy fighting each other, Assad could just keep on going.
Man, talk about playing your enemies against each other. But, okay, let's step back for a second. Look at the bigger picture. Millions displaced, countless lives lost, a whole generation scarred by war. It's hard to even grasp the scale of this tragedy.
It's almost unfathomable. Our sources, they really paint a grim picture of the humanitarian crisis. Millions fleeing their homes, seeking refuge in neighboring countries, putting enormous strain on resources there. And those who remain in Syria, well, they're facing unimaginable hardships, food shortages, lack of health care, constant fear.
It's a refugee crisis on a scale we haven't seen in a long time. And then you've got the economic impact. Years of war has got to have devastated the Syrian economy.
Oh, absolutely. The Syrian economy is in shambles. The currency has plummeted. Inflation is through the roof. Basic necessities are becoming unaffordable. I mean, our briefing note mentions that in some areas, the Syrian pound is trading at 23,000 to the US dollar. That's just, I mean, that's crazy.
It's mind-boggling. Hard to imagine trying to survive in that kind of economic environment. And then you layer on top of that the international sanctions against the Assad regime.
Right. The sanctions, they were meant to pressure Assad, but they also ended up hurting ordinary Syrians, limiting their access to essential goods and services, making it even harder for the economy to recover. It's a tough situation. No easy answers.
Nope, no easy answers. But we can't just sit back and watch people suffer. The international community, they've got to step up, provide aid, and I'm talking serious aid on a massive scale.
Absolutely. Humanitarian aid is more urgent now than ever. Food, water, shelter, medical care. People need help rebuilding their lives, rebuilding their communities. And that aid needs to reach everyone who needs it, regardless of their political affiliations or where they live.
It's a massive undertaking, but it's got to be done. No excuses.
I completely agree. And while we're talking about rebuilding, we need to think long term, too. Rebuilding Syria, that's not just about putting the pieces back together physically. It's about healing the wounds of this conflict, bringing people together.
Right, that's a long road. Homes, schools, hospitals, roads, the entire infrastructure needs to be rebuilt. But then there's the even bigger challenge of rebuilding trust, addressing all the pain and anger, creating some sense of shared national identity. It's a lot.
It's huge, and it's going to be incredibly difficult. And then you add the economic challenges on top of that, attracting investment, creating jobs, getting industries back on their feet, restoring basic services. Where do you even begin?
It's daunting, to say the least. And it's not a job for Syria alone. The international community, they need to be partners in this, providing financial assistance, expertise, diplomatic support, the whole 9 yards.
Couldn't agree more. But of course, with international involvement comes, a whole new set of questions. How do we make sure that aid is used effectively, that it's transparent? How do we hold those responsible for war crimes accountable?
Right. And how do you balance the need for stability with, the desire for justice? These are tough questions. And honestly, it's tempting to just throw your hands up and say, forget it. This is too messed up.
I get that. But we can't give in to that kind of thinking. The stakes are too high. The Syrian people, they deserve our support. They deserve our solidarity. We can't just abandon them.
Well said. We need to approach this with clear eyes, understanding the challenges, but also, with hope, with determination.
Absolutely. The road ahead is long and difficult, but we have to travel it together.
Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. And Talk Tickers listeners, we always like to bring things back to the markets. So let's shift gears for a minute. Let's talk about the potential market implications of this whole seismic event.
Okay. Yeah. That's a different kind of road, but it's an important one, especially for our audience.
Right. You guys are savvy investors. You're always looking for opportunities, even amidst global chaos. And let's be real, a regime change, the rebuilding of a nation, this kind of stuff creates both risks and rewards. You just got to know where to look.
And I'm sure some of our listeners are already thinking about potential investment plays.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But before we get into that, got to give the standard disclaimer. This is not financial advice, folks. This is just a conversation, brainstorming.
Yeah.
Always do your own research before making any investment decisions.
Always. But with that out of the way, let's talk about sectors that are likely to see a boost from this whole thing. Construction and infrastructure, that's got to be the most obvious one, right? Rebuilding a war-torn country, that's a huge undertaking. You're talking about everything from basic building materials to heavy machinery to engineering expertise.
So construction companies, engineering firms, suppliers of building materials, these are all companies that could potentially benefit.
Exactly. And given the amount of destruction in Syria, we're talking about a massive market. Of course, there are risks, too. It's a volatile environment, politically unstable. There are security concerns, corruption. You've got to be careful.
Right. But for those who are willing to take on a little more risk, there could be some serious rewards.
What about energy? I know Syria has some oil and gas reserves, but they've been pretty much untapped because of the war.
Yeah. That's right. And now, with the war winding down, there could be renewed interest in developing those resources that could benefit energy exploration companies, pipeline construction, refining, distribution. The whole chain is definitely something to keep an eye on.
It's a complex situation, for sure. But the fall of Assad, the possibility of a new era in Syria, it creates a whole new set of factors to consider for investors.
It does. And for those who do their homework, carefully assess the risks and rewards, well, there could be some really interesting opportunities out there. Okay, perfect segue into our This Is Not Financial Advice segment. All right, so hit me with it. Any totally wild but plausible trade ideas bouncing around in that brilliant mind of yours?
Let's see. We've talked about construction, we've talked about energy, but what about something a little more unconventional? Something that plays on the idea of rebuilding not just the physical infrastructure, but also the human capital.
Ooh, I like that. What are you thinking?
Think education. Think technology. Think about the companies that are developing these innovative online learning platforms, distance education, vocational training. The demand for those kinds of services is going to be massive in a country where a whole generation has had its education disrupted.
That's an interesting angle. Don't think I've heard many analysts talking about that.
It's definitely a bit speculative, but think about it. Syria is going to need skilled workers. Engineers, technicians, people with the knowledge and skills to drive their economic recovery. And online learning could be a way to bridge that gap to help young Syrians catch up and get the training they need.
That's a really good point. So ed tech, huh? A high risk, high reward play, something to keep on the radar?
Exactly. Do your research, of course.
Yeah.
But it's a sector with a lot of potential in this kind of situation.
All right, so there you have it, folks. A totally unexpected but totally plausible trade idea. Again, this is not financial advice, but it's a good example of how even in the midst of global chaos, there are always opportunities out there for those who are willing to think outside the box.
Absolutely. And it really highlights how interconnected everything is. What happens in Syria, it doesn't stay in Syria. It has ripple effects that can impact markets all over the world, commodities, stocks, investment flows.
Well said. All right, that wraps up this part of our deep dive into the Syrian civil war. We've covered a lot. Stay tuned for our next segment where we'll explore the potential geopolitical implications of this whole thing. What does the fall of Assad mean for the balance of power in the region? We'll find out.
Yeah, ISIS really did shake things up, didn't they? I mean, their tactics, their whole ideology, it just brought a whole new level of, well, horror to the conflict.
Yeah, no kidding. They weren't just fighting Assad, were they? It was like they were at war with everyone.
Yeah.
The other rebel groups, too, just added another layer of chaos to an already chaotic situation.
Right, exactly. And you know what? That actually worked in Assad's favor. While the rebels were busy fighting each other, Assad's forces could just, keep their focus, take advantage of the situation.
Like divide and conquer, right? Classic strategy. But okay, let's zoom out a little bit. Look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
This conflict, the human cost, it's just devastating. Millions displaced, countless lives lost. It's hard to even comprehend.
It really is. The humanitarian crisis is just massive. Our sources, they described as utter devastation. Millions of people fleeing their homes, seeking refuge in neighboring countries. And the burden on those countries, on their resources, it's huge.
Yeah, it's a refugee crisis unlike anything we've seen in a long time. And for the people who stayed in Syria, I mean, the conditions are just unimaginable. Food shortages, no health care, constant fear. It's, our briefing note, it doesn't paint a pretty picture.
It's grim, for sure. And it's only gotten worse since this latest offensive, the one that led to the surrender in Damascus. Like we talked about earlier, another 178,000 people displaced. It's just overwhelming, the whole humanitarian response system.
Yeah, the briefing note, it talks about a total collapse of basic services in some areas. No clean water, no electricity, no access to medical care. It's heartbreaking.
What about the economic impact? I mean, years of war, it's got to have had a huge impact on Syria's economy, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Syrian economy is in ruins. The currency has completely tanked. Inflation is out of control. Basic necessities are just, they're out of reach for most people. The briefing note, it mentions that in some areas, the Syrian pound is trading at 23,000 to the US dollar. That's just, it's hard to even wrap your head around that.
Yeah, it's crazy. How do people even survive in that kind of economic environment? And then you've got the international sanctions on top of all that. Right, exactly. The sanctions, they were meant to pressure Assad and his regime, but they also ended up hurting ordinary Syrians, limiting their access to essential goods and services, making it even tougher for the economy to recover.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation, that's for sure. No easy answers. But one thing is clear. We can't just stand by and watch. The international community, they have to do something. They have to provide aid, and I'm talking large-scale aid.
I agree. Completely agree. The need for humanitarian aid, it's more urgent than ever. People need food, they need water, shelter, medical care. They need help rebuilding their lives, their communities. And this aid, it has to reach everyone who needs it, no matter what their political beliefs are, no matter where they live.
Yeah, it's a massive undertaking, no question.
Yeah.
But it's also a moral obligation. We can't turn our backs on the Syrian people now.
Absolutely. And while we're talking about rebuilding, we have to think about the long term too. Rebuilding Syria, it's not just about, bricks and mortar. It's about healing the deep wounds that this conflict has caused. It's about bringing people together, fostering reconciliation.
That's a long road, for sure.
Mm.
The physical rebuilding, that's already a huge challenge. Homes, schools, hospitals, roads, the whole infrastructure needs to be rebuilt. But then you've got the even bigger challenge, the rebuilding of trust, addressing all the pain and anger that this war has caused, and somehow creating a sense of national unity. It's a
That
lot.
monumental task, definitely.
Yeah.
And then you add the economic challenges on top of that, attracting investment, creating jobs, revitalizing industries, restoring basic services. It's daunting.
It's more than daunting. It's almost overwhelming. And it's not something that Syria can do alone. The international community, they have to step up. They have to be partners in this whole process, providing financial assistance, sharing their expertise, engaging diplomatically. They have to be all in.
Totally agree. But of course, whenever you've got international involvement, you also get, complications. How do we make sure the aid is actually used effectively, that there's transparency? And what about accountability for war crimes? How do we balance the need for stability with the need for justice?
Yeah, those are big questions, and there aren't any easy answers, but there are questions we have to grapple with. As Syria enters this new chapter, we have to be prepared for the complexities that come with it.
I agree. It's tempting, to just look at the situation and say, it's too messy, too complicated, let's just walk away. But we can't do that. The stakes are too high. We have to stay engaged.
Absolutely. The Syrian people, they deserve our support, our solidarity, and we have to believe that a better future is possible, even if it's hard to see right now.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So as we move forward, we have to be realistic about the challenges, but we also can't lose hope. We have to approach this with a sense of, determination, a commitment to helping the Syrian people build a better future.
Well said, well said. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the humanitarian side of things, but Talk Tickers listeners, we always like to bring things back to the market. So let's shift gears for a minute. Let's talk about the potential market implications of all this. What does the fall of the Assad regime mean for investors?
All right, yeah, that's a good question. A different kind of road we're going down now, but an important one, especially for our audience.
Right, exactly. Our listeners, you guys are smart, you're savvy investors, you're always looking for opportunities, even when things are, a little chaotic globally. And let's be honest, a regime change, the rebuilding of a nation, this kind of stuff, it creates a lot of uncertainty, but it also creates opportunities. You just have to know where to look.
And I'm sure some of our listeners are already thinking about potential investment plays, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But before we get too deep into that, got to give the standard disclaimer. This is not financial advice, folks. Just a conversation, brainstorming. Always, always, always do your own research before making any investment decisions.
Always, always. Okay, so let's think about some of the sectors that might see a boost from this whole situation. Construction and infrastructure, that's got to be at the top of the list, right? Rebuilding a country that's been ravaged by war, it's a massive undertaking. You need everything from basic building materials to heavy machinery to engineering expertise.
So we're talking about construction companies, engineering firms, suppliers of building materials. All of those could potentially benefit, right?
Exactly. And considering the level of destruction in Syria, we're talking about a huge market, a lot of potential. Of course, there are risks involved, too, as with any investment in a volatile and unpredictable environment. Like we mentioned earlier, political instability, security concerns, corruption, those are all factors that investors need to carefully consider.
Right, for sure. But for those who are willing to take on a little more risk, the potential rewards could be significant. What about energy? Syria has oil and gas reserves, right?
Yeah.
But they haven't really been developed because of the war.
Yeah, that's right. And now that the war is winding down, there could be a lot of renewed interest in those energy resources. That could be a good thing for companies involved in energy exploration and production, pipeline construction, refining, distribution. The whole energy sector could see some benefits.
It's a complex picture, for sure. But it's clear that the fall of the Assad regime and the potential for a new era in Syria, it's creating a whole new set of considerations for investors.
Absolutely. And for those savvy investors out there who do their homework, who carefully weigh the risks and the potential rewards, well, there could be some very interesting opportunities on the horizon.
Okay, perfect. So let's get into our This Is Not Financial Advice segment for this episode. What about you? Any totally crazy but maybe plausible trade ideas you're thinking about?
Let's see, we've talked about construction, we've talked about energy, but what about something a little bit more outside the box? Something that plays on the idea of rebuilding not just physical infrastructure, but also human capital.
Ooh, I like where you're going with this.
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
Think education. Think technology. Think about those companies that are developing those, innovative online learning platforms, distance education programs, vocational training programs. In a country like Syria, where a whole generation has missed out on education because of the war, the demand for those services is going to be huge.
That's a really interesting angle. I haven't heard many people talking about that.
It's a bit speculative, I'll admit. But think about it. As Syria rebuilds, they're going to need a skilled workforce. Engineers, technicians, people with the knowledge and skills to drive the economic recovery. And these online learning platforms, they could be a way to bridge that gap, to help young Syrians get the training they need.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're saying ed tech. That's the play. A high risk, high reward kind of thing.
Exactly. Do your research, of course.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a sector with a lot of potential in this situation.
Okay, I like it. A totally unexpected but totally plausible trade idea. And just to reiterate, folks, this is not financial advice. But it's a really interesting example of how even in the midst of, global turmoil, there are always opportunities out there for those who are willing to think a little differently.
Well, absolutely. And it just goes to show how everything is connected, right?
Yeah.
What happens in one part of the world, it can have ripple effects everywhere. And that includes the financial markets.
Well said. Well said. Okay, so that wraps up this segment of our deep dive into the Syrian civil war. Stay tuned for our final segment, where we'll be talking about the potential geopolitical implications of all this. What does the fall of the Assad regime mean for the balance of power in the region? We'll be exploring all that and more. All right, Talk Tickers listeners, welcome back. We've been on quite a ride today, haven't we? Diving deep into this whole Syrian civil war thing, trying to make sense of it all. And now here we are, the Assad regime, it's over. The Syrian Arab Army in Damascus, they've surrendered.
Yeah, it's been a lot to process. The history, the human cost, the potential fallout, both economic and, for investors.
Right. And for this last part of our deep dive, I kind of want to shift gears a bit. Let's talk geopolitics. What does the fall of Assad actually mean for the region, for the world? It's a big question and a complicated one.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Huge implications. We could see alliances shift, new power vacuums pop up. This could reshape the whole Middle East.
So, okay, first things first. What happens to Syria? Assad's out, so who or what fills that void? Our sources, they offer some clues, but it's still a really fluid situation.
Yeah, our briefing notes suggest we're probably going to see a power struggle. A bunch of different factions within Syria, all vying for control. It's a mix of political groups, military groups, all with their own agendas.
Right, and then you've got all the external players, right? Russia, Iran, Turkey, the U.S. They've all been heavily involved in this conflict, and they're not just going to walk away now.
Nope. They've all got their own interests in Syria, and they're all going to be trying to influence what happens next. It's kind of like a big geopolitical chess game.
Okay, so let's break it down piece by piece. Let's start with Russia. They've been Assad's main backer this whole time. Military support, diplomatic cover, the works. What happens to their interests now?
Well, for Russia, it's all about maintaining influence. Syria is strategically important. They've got their only naval base in the Mediterranean there. It's crucial for projecting their power in the region.
So they're going to want to make sure that whoever takes over in Syria, they're friendly to Russia.
Exactly. They'll be pushing for a regime that's willing to let them keep their military presence and one that, generally aligns with their geopolitical goals.
Okay, so that's Russia. What about Iran? They've been a big supporter of Assad, too, financially, militarily. They even sent Shia militias to fight alongside Syrian government forces.
Right. Iran, they see Syria as a key part of what they call the axis of resistance. It's this network of Shia-aligned groups and states that stretches from Tehran all the way to Beirut.
So for them, keeping their influence in Syria, it's all about projecting their power in the region.
Yeah.
Counter their rivals like Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Exactly. They want to make sure any new government in Syria is on their side and that they keep supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Got it. And what about Turkey? They've been pretty active in the Syrian conflict, too, mostly because they're concerns about the Kurds, right?
Right. Turkey's main issue is with the Syrian Kurdish groups, specifically the YPG. They see them as an extension of the PKK, which Turkey and a lot of Western countries consider a terrorist organization.
So their whole goal in Syria has been to prevent the Kurds from establishing their own autonomous region along the border.
Exactly. And they've launched several military operations to stop that from happening. And it's likely they'll keep doing that, even with Assad out of the picture.
Okay, so that's Russia, Iran, Turkey. What about the U.S.? They've been involved too, but their role has always been a little, a little less clear.
Yeah, the U.S. is mostly focused on fighting ISIS, supporting the Kurdish-led forces in the northeast.
Yeah.
But their long-term goals, those have always been a little murky. And their commitment to staying involved, well, that's changed depending on who's in the White House.
So now with Assad gone, it's kind of a question mark. What will they do? They don't want to get stuck in another Middle Eastern quagmire, but they can't just completely ignore Syria either.
It's a tough spot. They've got to balance their interests in the region with the risks and costs of staying involved. Whatever they decide, it's going to have a big impact on what happens to Syria and probably on the whole geopolitical landscape.
Man, it's a complicated situation. And it's going to take some time for things to settle down, for the dust to clear, for the new power dynamics to really take shape.
It will, but one thing's for sure, Assad's gone. And that's a major turning point. There are going to be some big changes coming to the region and to the world.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, this special edition of Talk Tickers, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. What happens in the world, it matters. It affects us all. It affects the markets too. So stay informed, folks. Pay attention to what's happening out there. And as always, this is not financial advice.
Until next time.